I think it's important to stress that while many are asserting that it was more an economic spat between Saudi Arabia and the UAE as opposed to a political spat with regards to this OPEC deal, I think it's important to emphasize that the UAE and Saudi themselves, the parties to the conflict, did not interpret this as a mere economic spat. And that was reflected in the manner in which Abdul Khaliq Abdullah, the prominent UAE commentator, reacted to Saudi's travel ban to and from the UAE by suggesting fiha inna, that there is something sinister about it. This was not the way Dahi Khalfan, the former Dubai chief of police, reacted, in which he suggested that friends who sell other friends for profits ultimately lose, and that everybody at the end of the day only pursues their own interests. This is not the way even the Saudis interpreted it, in terms of how Saudi Twitterati were asserting that al-hallu fil Riyadh, that the solution is in Riyadh, that Mohammed bin Zayed must go to Riyadh and must explain himself. And indeed, it's not the way that Mohammed bin Salman himself interpreted it, given that not only did he impose the punitive economic measures with regards to the travel ban and with regards to slapping tariffs on UAE goods, but also he invited Khalid Mish'al, the Hamas spokesman, to appear for a one-on-one interview on Al Arabiya, which their only reason for this would be is to spite the UAE and suggest that this challenge from the UAE to Saudi Arabia's leadership, Saudi Arabia is ready to respond in kind by hampering UAE's foreign policy, in which normalization of ties with Israel is a key point. And it's important to stress that the UAE language in the beginning was one of challenge. It was one about flexing muscles against Riyadh. It was about withdrawing from OPEC if Saudi doesn't listen to us. And it was only later that it was tempered, and then a solution was eventually reached whereby the UAE agreed to half of what it had demanded with regards to the increase in production. But more importantly, it's important to state that Riyadh is still angry with Abu Dhabi despite reaching a solution with with regards to OPEC. Mohammed bin Zayed last Monday went to Riyadh in order to affirm the alliance between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And despite the public display of affection between bin Salman and bin Zayed, bin Salman did not rescind the travel ban imposed to and from the UAE. Bin Salman did not rescind the tariffs imposed on UAE goods or goods that have any Israeli input, suggesting that whatever bin Zayed said to the angry Saudis did not believe it worthy to go back to the pre-spat dynamics. This doesn't mean that the alliance between Saudi and the UAE is about to break anytime soon, but rather it reveals the conflicting perspectives with which both Saudi Arabia and the UAE approach this alliance, where the UAE seeks to establish a sort of equivalence with Saudi Arabia and assert itself in what it believes to be a relationship of equals. Saudi Arabia continues to see UAE as a junior partner, albeit a valuable one, that is expected to cede to the big brother. And we saw this in the manner that bin Salman unilaterally pursued reconciliation with Qatar and took for granted that he would be able to drag along a bewildered Cairo and a baffled Abu Dhabi into a reconciliation that neither of the two allies wanted. And it's also important to put this alliance within the context of what's taking place in the wider region, in that now the region is moving away from the fault lines that were established by the Arab Spring. These fault lines that drove Saudi Arabia into this embrace with UAE and into this alliance in the manner and shape that we see it today. Turkey now is shutting down Istanbul as a haven for Egyptian opposition activity, as Erdogan goes to extraordinary lengths in order to convince Sisi of the merits of reconciliation. Qatar now has abandoned its antagonism of Egypt and has publicly acknowledged or publicly recognized Sisi's government as the, quote, legitimate authority in Egypt. We see now that Qatar is taking advantage of its reconciliation with Saudi Arabia in order to try to wean Saudi Arabia's dependency on the UAE. We also see an increasingly emboldened Saudi Arabia that is no longer as isolated by the Biden administration as it was in the early days when Biden first came to power. We now see that as Biden balks at the Houthis' stubbornness in Yemen and Iran's stubbornness in Lebanon and with regards to the Iran deal, we see that bin Salman's value is increasing, and that's been reflected in Khalid bin Salman's visit to Washington and meeting with US officials last week. And this means that bin Salman now has greater options for partnerships, greater opportunities in his foreign policy than he had before. And this means that the UAE is increasingly no longer a partner by default in Saudi's numerous foreign policy initiatives.